Yes, we can do.
Excellent. Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to our next ECHA Zoom talk this evening. And I'll shortly introduce our speaker. Before I do so, just looking ahead to next month, the 12th of May, we have Dr. Joseph Shaw, who's chairman of the Latin Mass Society of England and Wales, who'll be talking about the Latin Mass in intellectuals, 1906 to 2007, no, 1966 and 2007. So that should be an interesting talk from Dr. Shaw, who some of you may know. Anyway, to introduce our speaker this evening, we have a wonderful talk, and here's a little bit of biography. So Susan Abernethy is our speaker. Her passion is history, dates back 50 years, and led her to study for a Bachelor of Arts degree in history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She's currently a member of the Rocky Mountain Medieval and Renaissance Association, the Society for Renaissance Studies, and the Historical Association. Her work has appeared on several historical websites and in magazines and includes guest appearances on historical podcasts. Her blog, The Freelance History Writer, has continuously published over 500 historical articles since 2012, with an emphasis on European, Tudor, medieval, Renaissance, early modern, and women's history. She's currently working on her third non-fiction book. So, Susan, very welcome. And this evening, you're going to talk about Queen Catherine of Braganza.
Yes, thank you so much, William, and to the association for the invitation to speak about Catherine tonight. My interest in her has been going on for many, many years. And I kind of feel like she's had a dubious reputation. She's been called the Forgotten Queen. And people tend to believe that she was kind of weepy and depressed and always in the background at court, because she wasn't as glamorous as Charles II's mistresses. How about the next slide? I wanted to talk a little bit about her early education and her life in Portugal. She was born the daughter of the most wealthy and powerful duke in Portugal. And the country had been ruled by Spain since 1580. And that was when Philip II kind of invaded and took over Portugal. And then her father, John, the Duke of Braganza, married a Spanish noblewoman, Maria Luisa Francisca de Guzman. And Catherine grew up in the palace of Villavicosa, which is just to the west of Lisbon, and it's in the countryside. And the family kind of lived in the country and enjoyed hunting and music and just kind of living a very quiet life. When she was about 2 years old, the people of Portugal had become dissatisfied with Spanish rule. The Spanish had promised to, put Portugal first and hire people in government positions that were Portuguese, and they kind of got away from that. And so there was a lot of discontent. And at her second birthday party, some people came to Villavicosa and they asked her father, would you be willing to become King of Portugal and accept the throne if we could overturn the current government? And at first, he was a little bit hesitant to do that. But his wife, Maria Luisa, she kind of stood up and said, yes, we need to do this. And she kind of pushed into it. So in 1640 of December, there was a bloodless coup in Lisbon, and her father became King John IV of Portugal. How about the next slide, William? The family moved to Lisbon in 1640, where she grew up in seclusion in the Ribeira Palace. And her mother supervised her schooling, which consisted of a convent education. Next slide, William. And it's unclear which convent exactly, and if she lived there, or did they take her to the convent on a regular basis, or did the nuns come to the palace to teach her there? But I believe that due to some interesting historical records, that it was the convent of the Holy Sacrament where she had her education. And this convent was established in 1620, and it served as a place of refuge and retirement for many Portuguese noble women. And I think her mother had an association with this convent. So this is where I believe she had her education. She also patronized this convent, and when she was a widow in England, she talked about retiring here. Her Portuguese biographer, Virginia Rao, believes that Catherine was very sincere in her faith and that she almost bordered on mysticism. And she had a very, very sheltered existence. She didn't go out much. She never received any instruction on government or politics or how to cultivate a following. And her parents were trying to promote an English marriage for her early on, but she never did learn the English language. And the best that she could expect would be a marriage that was commensurate with her status, and that Portugal would not be embarrassed in any kind of way. There were years and years of negotiations for her to marry King Louis XIV of France. I don't know if many people know this, but these negotiations dragged on and on because Portugal needed allies to fight for their independence from Spain. And so they were talking to France. And on several occasions, her mother believed that a deal had been reached for her marriage with the king. But she sent ambassadors to France, and they were kind of rebuffed and sent home. And then eventually some French ambassadors came to Portugal, and the talks resumed. But Louisa got frustrated with these talks, and so nothing ever came of the marriage to King Louis XIV. Like I said, her parents had always considered a marriage for Catherine or her sister Joanna before Joanna died. And this would be with the Prince of Wales of England. And they had contacts with King Charles I when he was still king. He was one of the first monarchies to recognize the Braganza dynasty in Portugal. And so they were grateful to him. One of the things that were discussed in the negotiations was Catherine's ability to worship as a Catholic in England, and also for Catholics in general to be able to worship freely. And this would be a major sticking point in the talks. And so with the fall of the Stuart dynasty, these negotiations were suspended. And King Charles was executed in January of 1649, and the monarchy was succeeded by years of the Protectorate and the Commonwealth. And the new king, who was Charles II, fled to the continent, where he spent 10 miserable years in exile. But in 1660, General Monk, who was the general of the troops in England, after the parliamentary government fell, called Charles II back, and then they had the restoration. And a wife for Charles II became the top priority, and an alliance with Portugal started to gain momentum. And so this time the treaty was finalized, and it would be the union of two restored dynasties, the Stuarts and the Braganzas. The next slide, please, William. The terms of the marriage treaty would have lasting consequences for Catherine's life. For her own situation, she was given personal chapels to worship in any of her residences. And the treaty also allowed for her to return to Portugal if her husband predeceased her. Now, the English were used to having a Catholic queen by this point because Anne of Denmark, the wife of King James I, had converted to Catholicism. And of course, Henrietta Maria, the wife of King Charles I, had been educated to promote the conversion of of England to Catholicism. And Henrietta Maria was very vocal, even going so far as to try to convert her children. And she definitely promoted a Catholic marriage for Charles II. And in this, she did succeed. And Catherine would be a little bit more circumspect in her promotion of her faith when she became queen, and we'll talk about that later. She made a long, arduous sea journey to England, and she finally landed in Portsmouth. And she was greeted there by her future brother-in-law, James, Duke of York. And from that point forward, these two were great friends. After a secret private Catholic rite of marriage, Catherine and Charles appeared in public for a curious wedding. And first of all, the chapel in Portsmouth had been destroyed during the Civil War. So in lieu of having a chapel, they went to the Portsmouth governor's house and set up a couple of thrones under a canopy on a dais. And during a ceremony, the terms of the marriage treaty were read out loud, and then Catherine assented to it and to the marriage. And she would never participate in an Anglican ceremony, but this was a royal wedding that was pretty unusual. I haven't ever seen any other wedding like this. Also, Catherine never had a coronation. Instead, when they had a sort of a big entry for Catherine into London, and it was an aquatic entry, so they had a huge parade on the Thames. And John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys, the diarists at the time, they have described this water parade, and it sounds like it was pretty spectacular. They had musicians and floats and all kinds of wonderful things on the water. The next slide, please. I wanted to talk a little bit about Catherine's patronage as queen. She was not in the background. She actually had some agency. What she did is she exercised her authority under difficult circumstances because her husband obviously was publicly unfaithful to her. And after initial conflict where Charles's mistress, Barbara Villiers, Lady Castlemaine, insisted on being given a position in her household, she kind of threw a tantrum. Catherine did have a fiery temper, and she threatened to return to Lisbon. And of course, this made Charles furious. So he ended up dismissing all of her servants, and she ended up being shunned by the rest of the court. But eventually, I think after she talked to her mother-in-law, Henrietta Maria, she made a drastic decision to make the best of the situation and to tolerate her husband's infidelity. And I really do believe that Henrietta Maria convinced her to do this. Catherine did love her husband, and she was always loyal to him. And they did get along very well together, although she did complain some about her treatment by the mistresses. Of course, her first duty as queen was to provide her husband with an heir. And she made numerous attempts at treatments and pilgrimages to become pregnant. And we do have proof that she was pregnant at one time, and the doctors confirmed that she did have a miscarriage. And Charles also mentions in letters to his sister Henrietta in France, also known as Minette, that she might have had 2 other pregnancies and 2 other miscarriages. So unfortunately, she was not able to provide Charles with an heir, and this would make her position difficult later in life. Another thing that Catherine did that I learned about when I was doing some research is that she held what were called circles at court. And this was in the tradition of her mother-in-law. So here I believe that Henrietta Maria also influenced her. And these circles would be in her own Catherine's own apartments at Whitehall. And they would have her on a throne, and then there would be people sitting in chairs in a circle around her. Also, people could come in and talk and gossip. There would be card playing, there would be music. Anywhere from Charles all the way down to the servants could come into these circles and have discussions during the evening. And it really was the place to be. Everyone wanted to be there. She also brought to England a full set of musicians, Portuguese musicians, and they mostly performed in her chapels, but sometimes she would have them give concerts at court. The Braganzas were known for their love and patronage of music. Her father was a composer, and he also had a huge collection of music. And both her father and her brothers patronized Italian music in Portugal. And Catherine would do the same thing, becoming known for her promotion and support of Italian music, musicians, and composers at court. Another thing she would do is bring in Catholic Baroque artists, such as the Flemish painter Jacob Huysmans and the Italian Benedetto Gennari, and both would paint portraits and also decorate her chapels. Some of Charles's mistresses had their own painters also, so I think she was kind of trying to compete with them. This patronage was not always only artistic, but she also used it as a political statement to counteract the influence of Charles's mistresses, especially Louise de Keroualle, the Duchess of Portsmouth. Another thing she would do is stage musicals, masks, and dances, and other interludes at Whitehall. We have evidence of this in the record. The next slide, William. I wanted to talk a little bit about Catherine's chapels, because these chapels were of primary importance to her. The chapel at St. James Palace was reserved for her personal use, and she had this redecorated to her preference and also established a small friary there. And there's an entry in Samuel Pepys' diary where he visits this friary and he talks about how nice and comfortable the rooms were and how they had nice windows and it had a nice garden. So it must have been a pretty nice place. When James, Duke of York, was negotiating for his marriage to Mary Beatrice of Modena, Mary Beatrice was promised the use of the St. James Chapel. But Charles later changed his mind and asked Catherine to claim that the chapel was still hers. Charles didn't want a public display of worship by James and his Duchess, and he also didn't want Italian priests to be, nearby. And this problem would cause a controversy between Catherine and Mary Beatrice of Modena, which would not be resolved until Charles died. And Catherine then would gift this chapel to Mary Beatrice. The next slide, please. Now, once Henrietta Maria died, she had lived in Somerset House and it was hers. But once she died, Catherine inherited Somerset House. And she also inherited the chapel that came with it. And the chapel also had a small friary and a friary church attached to it. When the Stuart regime collapsed in 1942, this chapel was one of the first royal icons to be attacked by the people. And it was sacked and the fittings were burned, and the altarpiece, which had been painted by Rubens, was stabbed with a pike and thrown into the Thames. So when Henrietta Maria returned to England in 1662, she had the chapel restored. And so Catherine would inherit both the chapel and Somerset House when she died. Once Louise Keroualle, the Duchess of Somerset, for all intents and purposes, took over Catherine's duties as queen, Catherine retired to Somerset House and basically lived an independent life there and worshipped in the chapel. And she would then attend events at court upon Charles's invitation. She also, I found where she asked Charles if she could go visit the ships at Chatham, and he agreed to let her do that. So she did have kind of a quiet life for a while there. The next chapel, or next slide, please. This is the next chapel. The Queen's Chapel at the Savoy was also under Catherine's aegis. And when she was widowed under the reign of William and Mary, this chapel either purposefully or inadvertently, we don't know, failed to say the prayers for King William's success in his cause against the Jacobites. And this would cause a lot of trouble for Catherine and with Queen Mary II, because the Queen believed that Catherine had Jacobite sympathies because she was such great friends with James, Duke of York, and Mary of Modena. In the end, Catherine's Huguenot chamberlain, Louis de Duras, Earl of Feversham, he took the blame for the omission of the prayers, but the damage to the relationship between Catherine and Mary had already been done. This is the most intriguing thing that I found out about Catherine. She established a Mary Ward convent in Hammersmith. Mary Ward founded a sect of non-cloistered nuns to carry out the mission of the Jesuits in educating Catholic girls, because during this time, Catholic girls were not able to get an education. They didn't have the right to that. And if they wanted to get an education, they had to travel out of the country to learn in schools on the continent. And Mary Ward had known Henrietta Maria. So it's very probable that Henrietta Maria told Catherine about this organization. And Catherine was on very good terms with the abbess of this school in Hammersmith. And when Charles died, she purchased a lease on a house near Hammersmith so she could be near the school and live there. The next slide, please. Okay, the Popish Plot would have a very detrimental effect on Catherine's life. But it would also have a positive influence in a way. There was a silver lining to the cloud. Titus Oates began his flight of fancy with his conspiracy theories about how there was a Jesuit plot to kill King Charles and put James II on the throne. And as part of this, he accused Catherine of wanting to poison King Charles. Now, Charles knew right away, he knew from the very beginning that these were lies, and he gave them no credence. But there were people in Parliament that wanted to use this plot to force Charles to exclude his brother James from inheriting the throne, as well as they wanted to influence Charles to divorce Catherine because she couldn't have children. They wanted him to marry a Protestant woman who could give him an heir. And this plot went on for years. Like I said, Catherine was accused of wanting to poison Charles. Her physician, George Wakeman, was accused of he was going to administer the poison. Eventually, there were people in Parliament, especially in the House of Lords, who knew Catherine personally, and they knew that she would never, ever kill Charles, that she was in love with him and loyal to him. And so it became ridiculous. And eventually, they kind of just dropped the charges against her. This plot took many years, and there were many innocent people who were executed, unfortunately. Catherine was never overt in her Catholic worship, and she never promoted making Catholicism the national religion. She treasured her chapels, and she regularly worshiped in these public spaces, and also allowed Catholics to worship and celebrate marriages and funerals there. But that was pretty much the extent of her actions in her faith. Because of her Catholicism, like I said, her position was very precarious. The king stood by her, and he made it clear that he would not abandon her. And their relationship would become stronger during these years. And so she moved back into court at Windsor with Charles, and they actually spent some blissful moments together for a while. And even the Duchess of Portsmouth departed for France, leaving the king and queen alone. So it did kind of help their relationship in the end. And I have to give Charles credit for standing by her. Charles died in February of 1685, and his brother James did become King James II. And her years under King James' reign were probably her happiest in England, because she could practice her religion freely, and she got along well with the king and the queen. And she did begin her attempts to return to Portugal during this time. And James was a little bit disappointed, but he regretfully agreed to provide her with ships to return. What happened was everything was in the works to move, and she had the ships and she was getting ready to move her personal belongings. But at the same time, she ended up having a lawsuit against her treasurer and her receiver general, Henry Hyde, the second Earl of Clarendon, whom she believed had embezzled money for her. And this lawsuit took about 2 years to settle. And she also was diagnosed with a breast illness and had to postpone her trip in order to recover. Next slide, William. Once William and Mary took the throne, Catherine's circumstances greatly changed. And like I said, the Queen believed she had Jacobite sympathies. People attacked her chapels. She eventually fled London, fled Somerset House to live in a small cottage in Islip for her own safety. And she only occasionally returned to Somerset House to hear Mass because it was just too dangerous for her. Also, I need to mention that when Charles died, he did convert to Catholicism on his deathbed, and that probably made Catherine very happy. After many attempts to return to Portugal, Catherine finally gained permission from her brother, King Pedro II, to return, and King William agreed to give her ships that she needed to transport her household. Her journey took several months as she became ill on the way and took her time. While she was in Rouen in France, she visited some of the Mary Ward sisters who had a school there, and she had a picnic. There's actually a description of this picnic, even lists what she ate that day. She also made a long stop at the baths in Bourbon, and she enjoyed her ability to worship as a Catholic without any hassles in France. The next slide, please. Once she arrived in Portugal, she stayed in various places, but eventually she built for herself a palace of Benposta. This was not really a very grand building. It was more like a country estate. And it was in this palace that she greeted the Archduke Charles, the younger son of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, and Grand Alliance candidate for the throne of France in the War of the Spanish Succession. And some parts of the chapel that she built here still exist, but the rest of the palace was destroyed in the earthquake of 1755. And you can see her coat of arms at the top there underneath the cross. As a widow in Portugal, she would gain wealth and power. And while there is no historical documentation to support this, she may have had some influence in the negotiations for the two treaties of Methuen in 1703, because she always pursued a pro-English policy while she was in Portugal. The commercial treaty is sometimes called the Port Wine Treaty, and this gave preferential treatment because Portugal promised to cease prohibitions on the import of English woolen cloth, and England promised to favor Portuguese wines by charging only 2/3 of the import tax, which was due on the French wines. And these treaties were military as well as commercial. King Pedro at first did not want to get involved in the War of Spanish Succession, but he was finally persuaded to join the Grand Alliance with England. The treaty allowed the troops to use Portugal as a base in executing the war. And when Pedro went to engage in the fighting, he named Catherine as regent because his sons were too young. He also trusted Catherine. And Malin Nuit, the Portuguese historian, says that everything that King Pedro did was to impress his sister, which I thought was an interesting comment to me. When Pedro returned from the campaign, he suffered a stroke. And so once again, he named Catherine as regent. She was very diligent in her duties as regent, and she worked very hard to make sure the troops had their supplies. She had to work with a council, and the council was, they didn't like working for a woman. I'll just say it that way. And they kind of gave her a little bit of trouble, but she was very strong, and the English were very impressed with Catherine's work as regent. And there's comments about that in the historical record. While she was exercising her duties, she became ill in December of 1705 with a colic and died in her palace of Bemposta. And they gave her a grand and magnificent funeral, and she was buried in the Church of the Hieronymus Monastery in Lisbon. In the 19th century, her remains were reburied along with the rest of her family, and that's where she is today. I wanted to talk a little bit about the legacy of Catherine. In my book, I wanted to show that there was more to her than just, being the sad wife of Charles. That the marriage treaty that was negotiated for her to marry Charles would have lasting influence on England. What happened was the port of Bombay and also Tangiers in North Africa were included in this treaty. Tangiers ended up being a drain on the treasury, and Charles ended up destroying the city not long after England took it over. But in Bombay, what he did is he leased the 7 islands that were there to the English East India Company. And of course, they used that as their base to begin their empire. When people talk about Catherine, they mention that she might have brought marmalade to England. And I found out this wasn't really true. The Portuguese did bring marmalade to England, but it was during the reign of King Henry VIII. And it was a lot of recipe books have recipes for marmalade, so she didn't exactly bring it, but the Portuguese did. Another item that was brought to England kind of through Portuguese trade was porcelain from China, and also cane or rattan, which was a weed that could be woven into different things. And for a long time, the chairs in England were like walnut and very heavy and kind of square and boxy. And when cane came to England, what they would do is weave the seats and also the backs of the chairs. There was also a machine called a poppet or a lathe that could carve the wheels, the legs of the chair into different shapes. And so you started to have lighter, easier to move chairs. During the Great Fire of London in 1666, people lost a lot of their furniture, and these chairs were made on an assembly line, basically, and people started to buy them after that incident. Another thing that Catherine brought with her were some lacquered cabinets, and John Evelyn in his diary mentions these curious cabinets that were at Hampton Court that she had brought with her. And these are the black cabinets that you see that have, they're painted with gold and figures, and they would have like doors that swiveled open and latched, and people could put their porcelain and other knickknacks into these cabinets and display them. And to go along with the porcelain, people started to drink tea. And I just want to say that Catherine did not bring tea to England. Tea was in England as early as 1620. And the Dutch had medicinal books that were written at that time, and these books came to England. And so tea was pretty much used for medicinal purposes. It was very expensive in the early years. But then the more tea that came into the country, the cheaper it became and more popular. Catherine did kind of introduce the social drinking of tea and made it popular at court, along with other aristocratic ladies. So that's what she's kind of famous for. So I just want to say I go into this more in depth about the legacy of her marriage treaty in my book, which is going to be released at the end of April in England. And it's available from your favorite bookseller there, Blackwell's, bookshop.org, Amazon, any of those booksellers have it. And if you're in the US, you can order it from Blackwell's and they will ship it to you. It's also available from your favorite bookseller in England and in the US. And it will be released in June in the US. The next slide, William. Thank you very much. I appreciate you allowing me to talk today.
Excellent. That was a really interesting talk. I've personally learned quite a lot there about her. So it's really interesting. If anybody has any questions, if you'd like to put them into the chat box, you'll see that probably the bottom of your screen. And I put welcome to the Zoom talk in the box. So if you have any questions now, and I could either read them out or Susan could see them. So whichever is appropriate. So if you can put some questions in there or comments, that would be very helpful. One thing that sort of interested me really is how did she sort of square her Catholic faith with an unfaithful husband who had numerous, I don't know how many different lovers or whatever, almost like a harem really. But how did she cope with that, I wonder?
I just really think she was a very strong person.
I think most women would be very, very angry or something like that.
Well, I'm going to say she was angry and she did berate him several times. They have descriptions of her yelling at him, over how she was being treated by some of these mistresses. But I really think that, she just loved him so much and was so loyal to him. And it went both ways. I think he really felt like his brother James and Catherine were probably two of the most loyal people he had in the whole world. So he kind of reciprocated, the love that they had. I think her mother-in-law was very instrumental in how she coped with everything. She just kind of told her.
Was she sort of advisor? She was Henrietta Marie was a kind of an advisor or a shoulder to cry on or something.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. The title of the book is Charles II's Portuguese Queen, The Legacy of Catherine of Braganza. My
Available from all good.
My inspiration for this book is I had read a fiction book about her many, many years ago when I was a teenager, probably. Jean Plaidy was a famous writer of British history books, and there's just something captivating about her. She's the only Portuguese queen of England, the only one. And I think it's interesting that at the age of 23, she left Portugal, not knowing the language or anything, and went to England and was in a very, very difficult situation. And even after that first, problem she had with the mistress wanting to be in her household, she had a temper tantrum and she threatened to return to Lisbon. But then she kind of just turned it around. And I found that really interesting that she was strong enough to do that. I just wanted to show that there's more to her than what everybody thinks from the books.
Do you
and
think
yes, go ahead.
Sorry, it's just. Do you think Charles's conversion to Catholicism on his deathbed was because of her or connected to her faith in some way?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think that his mother probably influenced him more than anyone from the very beginning. Yeah, she had something to do with it. I'm sure she tried to talk him into it. when Charles did the Treaty of Dover in 1670 with King Louis XIV, and his sister Minette, he promised then to convert to Catholicism, and that was in 1670. So I think early on he was planning on doing it at some point.
But he of course, was saved after the Battle of Worcester by the Catholic community, the requisite families, and a priest in particular who hid him and arranged for him to be moved and sort of escaped out of harm's way. And I think he never forgot I've forgotten the name of the priest offhand, but he never forgot this priest, and this priest was the one who received him into the church on his deathbed as the very same priest, in fact.
That's correct.
So famous story.
Huddleston, Father Huddleston was the one.
Right, Father Huddleston, that's correct. Yes, I should be able to remember that name. Yes, yes, yes. So there's probably multiple reasons, perhaps, but perhaps he confessed all these various affairs and things that he'd had, on his deathbed, and was actually quite sorry for it. Maybe one could imagine, but I don't know. Let's see if there's any more questions or comments in the box.
I saw one about forks and knives.
Yes.
I did find a reference that early in her marriage, she was at a public dinner and she was using a fork, and people kind of marveled at that. But I've also read recently, I think it was Lucy Worsley said that Charles had been in Europe for 10 years and he had seen people use forks, so he might have had something to do with that too.
So people ate with their fingers often, which was probably considered rather barbaric by some people on the continent or something, perhaps. Yes, it seems strange, doesn't it? A fork being a sort of a revolutionary idea.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, what was that last question?
Somebody said, is there any evidence to the claim that Catherine introduced the habit of using? Oh, we've read that one already. Somebody else put a brilliant talk, one of my favorite ECHA talks so far. Well, there we are. That's high praise, because we've had a lot, really. I first learned about Catherine from Jean Plaidy, book 2. So obviously a fan of the same book. She said, how do you think her lack of a direct heir affected her position at court and her psychology? I expect it would be very profoundly affected her, I expect.
I would say that's probably the biggest disappointment of her whole life. Yes. And she tried everything imaginable, going to the baths, seeing physicians, going on pilgrimages. And Charles saw this. There were rumors when they were negotiating the marriage treaty that from the Spanish ambassador, of course, that Catherine could not have children. But there's no way he could have known that at all. And truly, she did get pregnant. So it's not true that she couldn't get pregnant. But she tried everything, and Charles saw this. And so he knew how hard she worked at it. And once she kind of came to grips with the fact that she could not have any children, that's when she kind of retired from court and lived at Somerset House, along with the mistress taking over too. But it had a profound effect on her life, for sure.
Yeah, it was I've heard the story about the chapel at Somerset House being raided by, I presume, Puritans or something of that sort in 1642, and destroying artworks and throwing things into the River Thames. It's just shocking, really, the sort of vandalism of that era and that age, and their lack of appreciation of anything artistic or creative. And it just seems terrible waste and a shock, really, especially that painting that was lost as well.
I agree.
But the Chapel of the Savoy is interesting, isn't it? It's a survival of the original Savoy Palace, I think, from long ago.
It was built by Henry VII, I believe.
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, it's still there anyway, the Chapel of the Savoy. So if anybody's able to visit it on the Strand. But I was interested in the connection between Mary Ward in Hammersmith as well, because
Mhm.
she has a strong Yorkshire connection. She was from York, I think,
Yes, she
and
was.
in 1642 she kind of retired to Hutton Rugby, which is a village where my sister and family live, in North
Oh,
Yorkshire. There's no sign of the manor house. I know where it was by the river, but there's absolutely no sign whatsoever of it. I've had a look. It's just pretty much opposite the church there in Hutton Rugby. But yeah, she lived there for a while and then moved to York and died in York. So it's an
mhm,
she's a very interesting character, Mary Ward. So
mhm.
worth looking into. Maybe somebody will do a talk on her at some point. Do you think misogyny had any sort of part of the sort of people's attitude towards her, whether they're sort of at court or in the general public?
Misogyny for
Or
what
do
is
you
the
think
question?
do you think they people would because she was a woman and she had influence and so on, whether that they were sort of any attitudes against her just as a woman in a powerful position?
Absolutely. Yes, yes. Especially some people in Parliament. They didn't like that she had as much influence on it as she did because
Mm,
he would not disown her or divorce her at all.
yeah.
So yes.
And being a Catholic
Mhm.
probably made it worse, I expect.
Oh yes. That she had two strikes against her. Yeah.
Yes, being a woman and being Catholic is sort of like you can't get much worse, really, I suppose, in those days. Unfortunately,
Mhm.
times have changed somewhat, but yeah, it was a difficult time. I suppose Henrietta Maria had a similar sort of experience as well.
Mhm.
Um,
She did.
People opposed her for influencing the king, and being a Catholic was like, I suppose today it would be like being Russian or something or other, thinking this person must be an enemy and a spy or something of that sort. Um,
Exactly. Mhm.
there's something else. Somebody's put Darren Reynolds, but I know Darren. He lives nearby. I was talking to him the other day. Forgive my ignorance. I came in late. Why did Portugal side with England against Spain?
Mhm. Well, I have to say that Catherine had something to do with that because her brother did not want to get involved with the War of Spanish Succession. And if he did, he was favoring France at the time. But once his sister came to Portugal, I believe she influenced him because she always had a pro English policy in Portugal. So she probably told her brother, you need to get involved with these people on the side of the Grand Alliance and fight for the Habsburg candidate.
Hope that answers Darren's question. Anyway, I'm just seeing if there's any other ones. Can't see any more at the moment. I was interested in a story about marmalade. I didn't know marmalade came from. I knew it had come from somewhere, but I didn't know it was from Portugal actually. So next time I'm eating marmalade, I'll have to think about that. And tea as well. I mean, tea, the connection with tea as well. And I mean, you think of tea as such a British thing, and yet it's not really when you think about it. It's obviously a foreign import, obvious for obvious reasons. But I mean, I suppose the British occupation of India later on and sort of the tea trading increased dramatically. But at first, it was sort of regarded as a luxury medicine or something of that sort, wasn't it? And
Yes, it
rather
was.
different from today. Although Americans have a reputation for throwing it into harbors, I believe. But anyway, it's another story. Yes, it doesn't improve it by throwing it into a harbor, but and the black furniture as well was interesting, and the rattan furniture and porcelain as well. I mean, so many of these things that are part of British history, English history, and you think are so English, or whatever. So much of it's come from abroad, from the colonies and various other places, and being adopted. And I suppose the British are like that, sort of accepting all these different things from different places, and which makes up the patchwork of British culture, really. But it was very interesting. Anyway, are there any other questions anybody would like to ask at all before we finish? But it's certainly been a fascinating and interesting talk, and I thought I knew a little bit about it before, but there's lots I didn't know, I think. Um, and I think it's very important personally to emphasize these women in history because I feel very strongly that women should be front and center of history, especially English history, but you know, in any history, because they were always 50% of the population, and in any case, and sometimes in positions of authority or responsibility, and so on. In the case of a queen or other people like that. So I think there's a huge amount of women in history. I mean, we've had talks on Queen Mary the First, and we'll have another one from Joanna Strong a little bit later on in the year, I believe, on Queen Mary. And we've had talk on other women, the queens, and so on. So it's an interesting theme. I think we seem to come back to time and time again, which is only quite right, really. But Angie says thank you, very interesting talk. So I think that's all the comments that we've got. We've had a good audience today, and it's been very, very interesting. So thank you very much, Susan. So
Thank you so much for having me.
yeah, well, it's our pleasure, and you know, it's great to have such an interesting speaker, and an interesting subject as well. So it's been fascinating. So you know, do come back again and do another talk if you'd like to at some point. If you write another book, perhaps. Um, but the book is available from lots of different places. For example, Blackwell's in Oxford, and other such places that supply books anyway. So thank you very much again, and we look forward to our audience being here again on May the 12th for Dr. Joseph Shaw, talking about the Latin Mass, which should be an interesting thing. I'm looking forward to speaking to him again. And thank you very much, and thank you to our audience. So good night.
Good night.